Sir Desmond Stirling in Dreadrock's Holiday, Part 6.
Old Jethro, in the robe of a devil worshipper, preparing an altar for some no doubt sickening and nefarious ritual. I hadn't seen that coming. But I wasn't entirely convinced. I've encountered many of these villainous rogues. I've looked in their eyes and seen the festering pools of beastliness within. When I stared right at old Jethro, all I saw was lumpen idiocy. A man with the respiratory system of a fish, and quite possibly the brain to match. Old Jethro wouldn't be the ringleader of whatever dastardliness was going on here. He would, at best, be a doltish follower. Besides, I'd never known a magus who lit his own candles, idle sot. Old Jethro turned away from the altar and held out his arms. He was approached by about half a dozen robed figures. "Greetings, brothers in darkness." He'd pinched that from one of my books. The nerve. The robed scoundrels gathered round the altar. I held my breath in anticipation. I'd written about many such rituals in my time, but had attended very few. I usually made my excuses and left before a chicken's throat was slit or a virgin was defiled. "Greet the master!" old Jethro bellowed. As one, the disciples turned towards the entrance of the cave and lay prostrate on the floor. A fellow in a rather snazzy red velvet robe approached, the hem of his robe picking up all sorts of muck from the cavern floor, which would surely require dry cleaning afterwards. Should have had his robe turned up, I thought to myself. Short ass, I guessed, who wouldn't admit that he needed a shorter frock. The scarlet-robed fellow walked to the altar and turned to face his prostrate lackeys. "Tonight is the culmination of our dreams. Everything we have strived for, fought for, sacrificed our jobs, our money, and in one case our grandmother for." He gestured to one disciple who nodded. "After tonight, the world will be ours for the taking. Disrobe." All the disciples shed their robes and stood in their unashamed nakedness. Well, apart from one cove who was wearing a pair of somewhat grubby underpants. The magus snapped his fingers crossly at him, and the disciples sheepishly removed said Y-fronts. He didn't know where to put them, so flung them over his shoulder. They landed on the rock behind which I was hiding. Army and Navy store own brand. My trained eyes soon spotted that one of the disciples was actually a woman. I think she was the old dear who ran the newsagent on the front of Poltack's riots. On the day I arrived, she sold me a telegraph, the latest titbits, and a bar 6. I wouldn't have put her down as a Satanist, which just shows you never can tell. I wondered what the next stage in the ritual would be. Many are, disappointingly, just a lot of chanting and mumbo-jumbo, nothing fruity at all. An orgy? I didn't envy them that, considering the quality of participants. A sacrifice? But of what? Or whom? The Johnny in the red robe lifted up a particularly vicious-looking knife from the altar. He raised it above his head, and then stabbed it down into the altar where it stayed, vibrating from the impact. Then, with a, to my eyes, somewhat effeminate flourish, he flung off his robe. No, didn't recognize him, and I'm fairly au fait with the world's most notorious diabolists. He was a mousy cove, getting on a bit, one of those curious hairdos where hair is scraped over their egg-like pate. And I was previously correct, he was not tall. Unsurprisingly, no Johnson to speak about either. I felt rather reassured. I was in the presence of an amateur. I hadn't the foggiest what was going on here, not just from this motley lot, but the ghostly galleon, old Jethro's gills, not to mention the empty diving suit. but this chap wasn't exactly A-list in the world of necromancy. The master threw back his head and started chanting. Tasnem, Zudazre, Wenam, Zudas, Namd, Loin. Not an incantation I recognized, but, trade secret here. I just make up the ones I use in my books. Better safe than sorry. His acolytes repeated it while shuffling awkwardly in a circle round the altar. I must say that if they'd been my disciples, I'd have booted them all up the arse for such lily-livered worship. Put some damned welly into it. Tarsnam, Tezudasre, Waynam, Tezudas Namd Loim, they mumbled into their chests. Honestly, and with such splendid acoustics as this cavern offered. With a swiping motion, the master gestured for silence. And now, he bellowed, it is time for the sacrifice. Here we go, I thought. Time for some poor poultry to face its maker. The master raised his hands to the ceiling. Bring me Sir Desmond Stirling. And the rotter pointed at where I was hiding.
Sir Desmond Stirling, in Dread Rock's Holiday, was written and performed by Anthony Keetch.